مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. صدر مؤخرا هذا البيان عن البيت الأبيض الذي قال إن الرئيس بايدن سيلتقي نظيره الروسي الرئيس بوتين في مدينة جنيف السويسرية في 16 يونيو 2021، وسيناقش الزعيمان عددا كبيرا من القضايا الملحة في إطار سعينا لاستعادة الثقة والاستقرار في العلاقات الأمريكية الروسية. هذا لقاء مهم. طوال 4 أعوام ربطت الرئيس ترامب علاقة غريبة بالرئيس الروسي أثنى فيها على صداقته، ولم يرد على الانتهاكات الروسية المتكررة، بما في ذلك الهجمات الإلكترونية على نظامنا الانتخابي، حتى مع استمرار إدارته في فرض عقوبات شديدة جراء أنشطة روسيا غير الشرعية في جزيرة الكرم واغتيالها للمنشكين في الدول الأجنبية. الآن الرئيس بايدن مستعد لأن يحاول الكلمات إلا إفعال ويكون أكثر صرامة مع موسكو. ماذا ستشمل الأجندة في جنيف؟ هل ستشمل القضايا المهمة في الشرق الأوسط مثل سوريا وليبيا وملف إيران النووي؟ بشكل عام، مع استمرار الاقتصاد المخيم على اقتصادنا، هل يمكن أن تكف أمريكا في وجه روسيا والصين كلتيهما في نفس الوقت؟ لمناقشة هذه القضايا المهمة يسرني أن أرحب بضيفينا خبيري الأمن القومي وانزراتي ودينيس روس. Welcome back to داخل Washington. American politics is focused on domestic issues, of course, near the end of the fight against the pandemic, our economic recession, etc. But the world goes on. And as an important sign of that, President Biden is off soon to meet with President Putin of Russia in Geneva. Why are they meeting in a neutral capital? What is on the agenda? What is in store for this first superpower engagement by the new American leader? To discuss these issues, I'm delighted to welcome back Dennis Ross and Juan Zarate. Gentlemen, glad to see you. So Dennis, why is President Biden meeting President Putin in a neutral country?
The idea for the summit was President Biden's, but obviously he didn't want to invite Putin here, mostly because that would imply that this is actually a very warm relationship that he wants to build. On the other hand, he also wants to have a meeting with him because he feels, I think quite legitimately, that there is a need for us to create some rules of the road between us, at least some ground rules that will be understood, certain thresholds that won't be crossed. Meeting in Geneva is a neutral capital. It's not the first time there have been meetings between American presidents and Russian officials or leaders in Geneva. You can go back to actually the Eisenhower administration when you had this, what was known as the Spirit of Geneva. That was, of course, the Soviet Union then. So there's a history of having meetings in Geneva just because of neutrality. The desire to have a relationship where at least we create not just some ground rules, but we also see, are there some areas where we can operate? And clearly the president believes there are. So I think he wants to see if there's a way to create some stability in the relationship, but do it in an environment where he can make some points that's neutral, where Putin was also likely to come. And I think this was probably the right venue for that.
So Juan, how would you characterize Russia? Competitor, adversary, enemy? What's the right way to think of Russia today?
Rob, I think Russia is a provocative power, challenging the U.S. and its allies, not just in a physical context, as we've seen in Crimea and the Ukraine, or with its military buildup and promise of further military buildup on its western border, but also challenging the norms and standards of behavior. This goes right to the heart of human rights abuses, the detention of Navalny, the poisonings that the Russians have been responsible for, the cyber attacks that they've been responsible for, including the SolarWinds attack that the U.S. government has pinned directly on Russian intelligence services.
Dennis, one just described Russia as a provocative power. Do you accept that characterization, or is there some other way you think we should think of Moscow today?
It certainly has adopted an adversarial position. It is a competitor with the United States. It wants to redefine the rules of the international system so that the U.S. isn't the one that is, in a sense, shaping those rules. It wants to show it can compete on the world stage with the United States, but certainly a competitive power, and has used provocative means to try to elevate itself and to try to undercut the United States. Everywhere it sees the United States, it's actually trying to weaken the American presence. So I certainly would use the word adversarial. I wouldn't quibble with the idea of provocative, because there's a lot of provocative behaviors that we see Russia engaging in, where, in a sense, they're acting as if there aren't rules that limit what they can do. And until they pay a price, as they measure the price, whenever you're thinking about deterrence, it's not the price that you think should matter to the other side. It's the price that actually does matter to the other side. And I've always felt in Putin's case, if one begins to touch some of the oligarchs who matter to him in terms of their resources, their foreign bank accounts, that's much more likely to have an impression on him.
So I think it'd be very useful. One, can we just take a minute and remind our viewers what was particularly bold and worrisome about the Russian attack on American democracy? I mean, the Russians do all sorts of nasty things in various places, but the attack on American democracy was especially sharp and targeted and threatening. What did they do?
Bold and brazen involvement in two successive U.S. presidential campaigns at a time of heightened political discord in the United States. And it wasn't so much that there was an attempt to maybe influence the narrative in an election. We've seen that from foreign governments before. It was a more direct attempt to try to influence in two ways. One, using cyber means to get within certain electoral systems. So much more provocative as to what the Russians are intending to do with access to data, access to systems, but also then to stoke political divisions within the context of the political debate and the political discourse for the presidential elections in 2016 and 2020. That was in part what made this so brazen, the combination of those actions in an attempt to sow discord and discontent. And in the minds of many, and certainly the judgment of some in the intelligence community in the US, trying to favor one candidate over another, which again was quite provocative. Put that in context with other activities that the Russians are engaged in, other cyber attacks, other influence measures, and that looks incredibly provocative and damaging, and puts this all into a much different context domestically for the United States.
And Dennis, do you think that Russia has yet gotten the message from either this president or the previous president that they totally crossed the line and they will bear a heavy price for trying to manipulate American democracy?
I think it's fair to say he did not get that message from President Trump, in no small part because President Trump, in public with him, seemed to side with Putin as opposed to the American intelligence community. So he certainly didn't get the message from Trump, even if his administration actually imposed sanctions that actually were problematic for Putin. I think Putin's probably held the hope that he could yet persuade Trump and he would pretty much get in the end, what he wanted. I think with Biden, he's heard the message. Now, there's a difference between hearing a message and deciding that he has to adjust his behavior because of it. I suspect that he was quite quick to agree to see Biden. I think there are several reasons for that. One, to take the measure of Biden to make a judgment of, okay, how do I evaluate him up close? Two, I think also he loves the imagery of being a superpower on par with the United States. That's always been a major motivator for him. Three, because I think he sees it as an opportunity to also make points with Biden, meaning, okay, I'm prepared to respect the limits you want to impose, but you have to respect the limits I want to impose. And the limits on my side are if you intervene in our domestic politics. And Biden say, look, you've been intervening in ours. And in a sense, Putin's argument would be, you stop intervening in our domestic politics, we'll stop intervening in yours. I think this is going to be a major element of their discussion, and certainly it's what Putin brings with him to this discussion.
And Juan, when Putin tries to put his dissidents on par with the Russian attack on American democracy, what do you hope President Biden says in response?
I hope he doesn't fall into the trap of equivalency, moral, political, or diplomatic. And I think that's been one of the great tricks that Putin has engaged in diplomatically, is this moral and political and diplomatic equivalency across the board. And so I no doubt when President Biden raises human rights issues, Putin may go into one of his speeches around race issues in the United States and our interference in Russia and all sorts of things. So I hope President Biden pushes back in a way that is very clear that the activities that the Russians have engaged in, whether it's cyber attacks and involvement in our elections, or poisoning of dissidents, or provocative actions on borders in Western Europe, all of that is unacceptable. But I'm not hopeful, Rob. I mean, this latest air piracy incident with Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, where they forced down a Ryanair flight to land in Minsk to get custody of a dissident journalist, and then Putin welcoming Lukashenko right away in Sochi, and also then threatening the landing rights for European flights, for example, Air France into Moscow, in retaliation for what the European Union was doing to limit flights over Belarus and from Belarus. All of that is a bad signal, because it signals that the president of Russia, Putin, wants to continue to be provocative, wants to set his own rules, and is willing to bite back with measures that are painful to those imposing sanctions or otherwise imposing moral opprobrium on things that he or his allies are engaged in.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to continue this discussion and ask where Russia fits in the broader challenge that we call here in the United States great power competition, in just a moment. This horrible, terrible, dreadful school year is soon coming to an end. Yes, kids over 12 are now being vaccinated in America, and increasingly students are returning to the classroom. But generally, this was a lost year for millions of young Americans. So many parents may be looking for ways to supplement their kids' lost year with extra reading. If that's the case, I checked on lists of most essential novels for high school students, and here are 5 that I read when I was a kid that I highly recommend for students even today. 1984 by George Orwell. It's never too late to learn that Big Brother is watching. Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. The moral challenges of running away with a runaway slave resonate even till today. Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. The ultimate coming-of-age story in the most hopeless of circumstances. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Reading itself is on trial in this powerful, jarring novel. And Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. With vaccinations, we know that science can save lives, but as this story shows, even science has its limits. Do your children a favor. unplug their cell phone, turn off their Xbox, give them one of these books to read. You won't regret it, neither will they. So, gentlemen, let's take a step back for a moment. A generation ago, there was a great debate about how to deal with the East Bloc and post-Soviet countries. Many were incorporated into NATO, the Western Alliance, as part of a policy that the Clinton administration called democratic enlargement. Russia, however, said it viewed this as encirclement, not enlargement, and viewed it as a profound threat. Looking back on this question a generation later, was this the right thing to do back then? Dennis, you were around. What do you think?
I think the real issue is, did it make sense to expand NATO up to the Russian border? Clearly, when the wall came down and the Cold War ended and Germany was incorporated into NATO, there was no question of who had won the Cold War and who had lost. When we went beyond that and began to extend NATO close to the Russian border, I think it set off all sorts of alarm bells on the Russian side. Certainly in Yeltsin's case, he was prepared to go along. He even contemplated for a while, maybe they could be a member of NATO. But I think with Putin trained as a KGB officer, almost, I think, shaped by a sense of paranoia. This did look like the US was trying to basically humiliate the Russians. And I think it produced a backlash. Did we need to have all these countries in NATO? I'm not so sure. We during the Bush administration, which I was a part of, we came up with the idea of a partnership for peace. So there could be a relationship with NATO, but you didn't necessarily incorporate these countries into NATO. I understand that when you look at the Baltic states, they might be in a different category, especially given what happened, given the way they were incorporated, in a sense, taken over by the Russians, and had much more of a sense of looking towards the West. You could argue about Poland. I just think that the scope of the expansion came to a point where I think in Putin's case, he saw this as an effort to humiliate the Russians while they were weak. And it gave him enormous incentive to get back at the United States. You know, you obviously have to shape policies based on having to accommodate that. But I think we probably would have been wiser if we thought through all the implications of what we were doing with NATO expansion.
So, Juan, let's jump forward now and take a moment to look at Ukraine, a country, a piece of which Russia occupies, the Crimean Peninsula. And there are sanctions have been on Russia for years. Is this going to push Russia out of Crimea? What is the future of this controversy over this important piece of territory?
Going to be a lingering conflict and battle for some time, because there's no indication that Putin and Russia are going to lower the flags, in Crimea and depart. In fact, quite the opposite. They are further developing capabilities in Crimea. In the arms control context, it appears they may be deploying further weapon systems to Crimea. So for all intents and purposes, it looks like Russia is staking its place and ground in Crimea and is not moving, and is not being pressured by existing sanctions. I think there have been questions in the West as to whether or not this fait accompli has to be recognized. I don't think that is going to happen. Certainly the United States will not recognize it. But I think this is going to be a lingering dispute. And where we're left, Rob, then with the Ukraine is less the issue of forcing Russia out of Crimea in the first instance, but instead defending the eastern flank of Ukraine and defending Ukraine from hybrid warfare, which the Russians are clearly engaged in against Kiev. And that is really the issue here, solidifying the stability of what's happening in Kiev and defending it against further intrusion and meddling by Russia. Crimea, in some ways, becomes a second-order issue at this point.
And just to continue on this for a moment, what's your solution here? Some say that we should actually bring Ukraine into NATO. Would that make the problem worse or better?
I think there are other things that can be done short of NATO membership that signal that the West is supporting the government in Kiev. I think inviting them to meetings of NATO, providing them additional defense weaponry, doing more collectively on the oil and gas side, doing things that are productive and constructive to demonstrate that the Ukraine won't be abandoned, that it is tied to the West, and that there could be a constructive relationship moving forward.
Thank you for helping to explain superpower competition and the Biden-Putin summit to our viewers across the Middle East. Thank you for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. A joke made the rounds during the Cold War that went something like this. An American businessman was invited to Moscow to check out investment opportunities. Along the ride from the airport to the hotel, he saw one rundown factory after another, with broken windows, downed power lines, and guys outside the shipping docks drinking vodka. When he got to the hotel, he checked in and tried to go to his 5th floor room, but the elevator had a sign that said, "Out of order." When he finally made it to his room, the TV had a smaller sign that said, "Out of order," and even the telephone had a tiny sign that said, "Out of order." He finally gave up and went to bed. The next morning, an official from the Ministry of Industry picked him up in the lobby and said he was taking the American to the finest, most up-to-date, most efficient factory in all of Russia. The man finally perked up, especially given everything he'd seen so far. "And what does this factory make?" he asked. "Out of order signs," the official said. That was a generation ago. The situation really hasn't changed very much in post-communist Russia either. Russia makes very little the world wants, except caviar and weapons. When was the last time you heard of someone buying a Russian-made cell phone, a Russian-made refrigerator, or a Russian-made video game console? Indeed, Russia is a great power driving on fumes of a largely imaginary past, and on its leader's ability to play a poor hand well. Why does Russia matter? Not because it's a great power competitor, it isn't, but because it's a great power irritant, troublemaker, and to a certain extent, threat. For a small investment of power and a willingness to kill thousands and thousands of innocents, Russia has made a play of influence in places like Syria, Libya, and of course, Crimea. And with a small army of online terrorists, Russia has done its best to undermine America's democracy. And through it all, it retains a menacing arsenal of nuclear weapons. We don't need a confrontation with Russia, given the real and growing challenge globally we face from China. But Russia needs a real confrontation with us, even less. When Joe Biden meets Vladimir Putin, he will be able to restore balance to this relationship after the unusually fawning Trump years, putting this relationship on an even keel with candor, directness, and a clear assertion of American interests and strategic priorities is an important step in the right direction. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول السياسة الأمريكية حيال روسيا والصين في عهد إدارة بايدن، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.